Chaos in the U.S. House of Representatives. Democrats stage a sit-in demanding a vote on gun control laws. It's in the wake of the Orlando shooting that killed 49 people. But will it change anything? And is this the new normal in U.S. politics? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Darren Abuhgaida. Republican leaders adjourned the U.S. House of Representatives a day early on Thursday, as Democrats said they would carry on their protest demanding a vote on gun control. Republicans have blocked 4 amendments to the law since the Orlando shootings almost 2 weeks ago, and Democrats say they've had enough. But for many, the sight of lawmakers bickering in Congress and adjourning early is just another sign of a broken political system. Lots for us to discuss, but first, Al Jazeera's Shihab Ratansi sets up our debate from Washington, D.C.
Well, there are a few ways of looking at what's going on Capitol Hill. For the Democrats, clearly, it's a way to show what they say is Republican obstructionism, preventing much-needed legislation on a major issue that faces the United States. They can also point to the NRA, the National Rifle Association's hold over the Republican Party, preventing legislation on an issue which most Americans want legislation to be passed on. For the Republicans, they're dismissing all of this as a publicity stunt, but they can also use a very interesting argument that's actually also being used by progressives and civil libertarians in the United States. That is, to expand the remit of the terror watch list system in the US is not the way to curtail gun ownership in the US because it's unconstitutional, potentially unconstitutional. The terror watch list, instituted by George W. Bush, notoriously untransparent, with very little due process, no due process. In fact, people are just secretly put on this list. It's something that those on the left and progressives have long argued for. And now, interestingly, people on the right are saying, look, this isn't a terribly good way of curtailing gun ownership. The Democrats, though, also now have an issue which they can take into the elections. No one's necessarily, at least right now, expecting any legislation to pass. But come November, during the congressional elections, they have a very easy argument to make now. Very short advert it has to be with their opponents in their districts, and they can just say, look, my opponent is fine with terrorists owning guns. How useful that is in the debate over gun ownership, in the debate over gun violence in the United States, well, that has to be seen. But the Democrats clearly see some political advantage here.
Well, President Barack Obama's presidency has been marred by partisanship and bitter rhetoric since the start. During the 2008 election, Republicans compared him to Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. Some even said Obama was a Kenyan-born Muslim out to destroy America. And then the Tea Party emerged in 2009, expressing the most right-wing and anti-establishment agenda in recent history. The Democratic Party has also shifted away from the center, as shown by the unexpected popularity of candidate Bernie Sanders, who's a self-proclaimed socialist. A recent poll by the Pew Research Center suggests a record-wide ideological gap between Democrats and Republicans. And it says Obama's administration has seen the most extreme partisan reaction to government in the past 25 years. Time now to bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., we have Lara Brown. She's the program director for the Political Management Program at George Washington University. In New York, joining us on Skype is Arjun Appadurai. He's Goddard, professor in media, culture and communication at New York University. In Warwick, in the UK, Ben Margulies, research fellow in politics and international studies at the University of Warwick. Welcome to you all to Inside Story. Lara Brown, if we just start out with what happened in the U.S. House of Representatives itself, why not at least allow a vote for this bill to take place?
Well, certainly a number of Republicans may not want to be recorded on a vote that then could be turned into campaign commercials and used against them, assuming that they were to vote down any measure that would attempt to ban these terrorists on the no-fly list from purchasing a weapon. But there's also the other argument that Republicans are making, and I think has some legitimacy, which is, why should we take up a measure that was just turned away in the U.S. Senate and would have no possibility of passing both chambers of Congress and wouldn't make it to the president's desk? It is essentially a show vote, and they don't want to be entrapped in a show vote.
Arjun, do you agree with that? Republicans don't want to be trapped in a show vote. And also the House Speaker Paul Ryan came out and called what the Democrats did as a publicity stunt. Inflammatory remarks, or does he have a point?
Well, I think the idea that this is a publicity stunt is a strange thing to say coming from a politician who has feasted off publicity for himself and his party, along with politicians of every stripe. The idea that publicity is the problem here is ridiculous. On the other hand, clearly the issue of gun control after the Orlando shootings is once again a flashpoint, both in regard to the issue of guns and violence in American life, in regard to civil liberties and surveillance, and more generally in regard to the almost complete lack of common ground between the two parties as we build up to the November presidential election and the congressional elections.
Ben Margulies, what happens in July when Congress, when the House reconvenes?
I mean, the Democrats may attempt to press this particular issue in the House chamber again. I think, although publicity stunt is a dismissive way of describing the Democrats' own, very heartfelt desire for gun control, in terms of its actual effect, what they're mainly they have little chance of passing legislation. So what they are mainly doing is publicizing the issue and hoping to rally voters for the November election. So they may attempt further demonstrations on the House floor, less as a publicity stunt, as more of a way of rallying support, which the Republicans will probably try to evade, partly for the reasons Lara mentioned, that they don't want to be recorded as voting for or against such a controversial measure, and partly because I don't think they consider the Democratic proposals legitimate or their actions legitimate. There's a narrow chance that a much narrower measure that's being proposed in the Senate might somehow pass that body and come to the House, which draws on a much narrower, I think, the no-fly list. But that's not terribly likely. It's possible this could continue. It depends on whether the Democratic Party finds further publicity on this matter, further campaigning fruitful.
Lara, this is just one issue in which the Democrats and the Republicans are bitterly divided on. Parties are increasingly divided on a whole host of issues, as you know. So gun control is one that we're talking about, international trade, corporate, and the list just goes on and on. Why is that?
Well, this is actually a long story about why this polarization has increased over the years. But I don't think that you can dismiss the reality that our Congress is representing geographic areas of our country. And what we have seen over the years is that it is largely true that Democrats now live near Democrats, mostly in urban areas, and Republicans now live near Republicans in mostly suburban or rural areas. And so what we have is a Congress that, when everyone comes together, is tremendously divided on the issues, partly because their voters and their constituencies have very different beliefs about what those representatives should be doing. But is that a result of
the divide among society, Lara, a result of the divide in politics, or is it vice versa?
Well, I would argue that it's a vicious cycle. That what happens is that a member of Congress or somebody who is running for office attempts to use a wedge issue to get elected. They then go to Congress and attempt to grandstand on that, and that only sort of acts as a way to kind of coalesce these coalitions as opponents and really bitter enemies. And it just keeps kind of growing. And this is what we have seen, as Pew has documented, really over the last 2 decades, that one fight has turned into another, has turned into another, and has turned into a place where the most activist partisans, and this includes rank and file, are more fearful about a member of their own family marrying somebody from another party than they are, in fact, somebody from their family marrying someone of another race or religion or geography.
Arjun, according to a study as well, there's 27% of Democrats and 36% of Republicans who see the other party as a threat to the nation's well-being. That's quite a dangerous development, isn't it?
Yes, indeed, I think it is. I think Laura's point that there is a vicious cycle between what's going on in the grassroots and in the geography of the nation and what is happening in the Congress and Senate is well taken. But I think it's also worth observing that there's another puzzle or paradox, which is that at the same time as we have this remarkable polarization and mutual fear and suspicion between the major parties, it's also true that there's been a steady shift to the political right amongst all parties and all candidates. So Sanders is a strange exception because he represents a counter tendency to the broad trend in American politics, which is that everyone has become more security conscious, more worried about migration, more fearful about immigrants, more fearful of each other, and in general more ready to take strong measures, either legislative or outside the legislature, as a consequence of this gradual shift to the political right, which actually endangers what used to be a relatively strong liberal orientation at the center of American politics, which allowed for consensus between pragmatic Democrats and relatively open Republicans. That ground has disappeared as everyone has shifted more to the right. And that shift means that the grounds for consensus and the production of fear now falls on more fertile ground generally.
Ben, where do you think the responsibility lies for that growing divide that we're seeing between Republicans and Democrats?
I think there's some degree of debate in American politics about this. A number of people, Ornstein and Mann, for example, suggest that the main fault lies with the Republican Party, that the Republicans are primarily, of the two parties, it is the Republicans that have moved farthest and most rapidly from the center. For a variety of reasons. My personal theory is that the Republicans having come to represent an increasingly monolithic white bloc, are reflecting to a great deal the demographic and economic stresses that the previously dominant white American population, or segments of that population, are currently undergoing. So there's more evidence that is the Republicans becoming more extreme than both parties becoming more extreme at the same time. Arjun did mention that both parties have moved to the right, which is partly true because of the general decline of faith in state intervention. But I mean, I think we're also seeing increasingly, there are social actions, social trends that have tended toward polarization more broadly outside of politics. Increasing income inequality, the sort of assortative residential patterns that Lara mentioned, increasing racial tensions, which I mentioned, which have tended to create polarization even outside the party system. And to an extent, the parties are picking up or manipulating this, and politicians are manipulating this for their own benefit. Still, I think the most likely answer is that if you did have to assign blame between the two parties for polarization, it would be there's probably more people who would say, more evidence to argue that the Republicans are in fact the more responsible.
Lara, do you agree with that? That what I understand from Ben, he seems to allude to the fact that blame can be put on the fact that there is sort of a shift in values when it comes to the Republican Party.
Well, I certainly think that the Republican Party has had large incentives over the last, decade or so to continue to embrace, as Ben was just saying, this monolithic block of voters. And this is where I would argue that it's more than sort of demographics and voters. It's all of the electoral incentives. And let me just explain what I mean by that. You know, prior to 1994, the Democrats had held the majority in the U.S. House of Representatives for 40 years. We have now seen, essentially, the Republicans take over the House in '94, the Democrats take back the House in 2006, and the Republicans take back the House from the Democrats in 2010. That electoral cycle in and of itself has taught both parties that when you are in the minority, it is more favorable for you to obstruct than it is for you to compromise. And in fact, how you win back majorities is to obstruct, is to essentially demonstrate and try to explain to the American people that the party that is in the majority is not doing the public's bidding. So this whole process has become ratcheted up as our electoral system has also become more competitive in some ways across the parties and really incentivizing kind of divisiveness and sort of all of the enemy making that goes on.
But where
it's
does
much
this
more
all
favorable
lead to?
for you.
But Lara, where does this all lead to?
Well,
I'll remind you as well, back in 2013, the U.S. government partially shut down at the time. You'll remember that's because the House and the Senate couldn't agree on that spending bill to fund the government at the time. And Obama himself, Lara, saying at the time that what happened in Congress is dysfunctional. U.S. president saying that about Congress.
Well,
is Congress
I understand
dysfunctional?
that. But again, I think you have to look at the longer history. I mean, if you recall, Nancy Pelosi let the first TARP bill fail in 2008 when they were trying to rescue the financial system. And the day after the bill did not pass the House under Democratic control, the stock market dropped something over 400 points. So both parties have played with these shenanigans. I don't dispute that the Republicans have kind of amped up their tactics over the last, decade, but I don't think we should forget that the Democrats were tremendously obstructionist once they held the House between 2007 and 2008. I also think it's important to realize that where it all leads is actually back to what we are seeing, which is more and more people trusting and believing in their state governments. I mean, one of the things that is extraordinary is in this time of distrust in Washington, people do like their state and local governments. And that is also a reflection of the fact that many states have essentially trended more blue or more red in terms of being Republican or Democrat. And those state legislatures and those state governments have largely been more effective in passing legislation than has Washington.
Arjun, Paul Ryan as well in 2013 saying that the American people look at Washington, I'm quoting him here, and all they see is chaos. What a relief to them it would be if we finally got our act together. Do you agree with that? Can Washington get its act together at this point?
Well, yes, I think it's always possible, but I do think there are strong countervailing tendencies. One part of them Lara has pointed to, which is the growth in the trust of either city or local or state governments. There's always been a profound ambivalence about Washington. Many, many political careers have been made in Washington by arguing that people have that those candidates are outsiders to Washington. This is an old American theme, and I think what it reflects is the fact that, in truth, systemic power in this country is now very substantially in the hands of corporations and their allies in government, who tend to be on both sides of the floor and in the bureaucracy, so that all our central actors, up to and including the president, have rather limited say in what happens domestically. They do have a lot of say in what happens overseas. The result is a devolution towards the local that Lara has pointed out, and a sense that official politics in Washington is both chaotic and helpless. Nevertheless, this is a union. It is a federal system. The senators in particular, the members of the U.S. Senate, arguably are the most powerful 100 people in politicians in the world. They can do things, and I think we have seen periods in which bipartisan action, bipartisan sentiment has come to the fore. It might happen again. The crucial question is, will it happen on grounds of suspicion and fear of people from outside or of others, or will it happen on strong, progressive, civic grounds?
Lara, just back to you for a moment. How likely is that, especially considering that, let's look at the Republican Party for a second here when it comes to the upcoming presidential election and Donald Trump. The Republican Party itself divided over Trump's candidacy. So what do you make of that?
Well, what I really make of it is that if you talk to Trump voters and you go out on the trail, what you will hear from Trump voters is they don't really care what he believes in. What they believe is that he is a strong enough influence to be able to make Washington work. In other words, most of his supporters don't have really a strong sense of what he would do. Most of his supporters just believe that he, because of his past, can somehow bring Washington to the table to bargain. Now, what does that tell me? Well, what that tells me, and what I think it should tell the parties, is that the American people are a lot less ideological than these parties have been behaving in Washington, and that if these parties were essentially savvier, they would engage in more bipartisan compromise, and they would spend more time trying to make government effective. Because in fact, one of the things I do believe is true, and some of the political science research has borne this out, is that when Americans hear about Washington, they think it's broken and wrong. In other words, Washington is most liked when it is least discussed and noticed. And so all of these types of activities, whether they are filibusters, now sit-ins, and other sorts of, debt ceiling shutdowns, whatever they may be, that is what causes Americans to believe that the people in Washington aren't doing their job. They don't care as much about the issue as they do about the sense that Washington is working.
Ben, Donald Trump saying that he will make America great again if he's president of the U.S., Hillary Clinton saying that America has never stopped being great. If you look ahead to the upcoming presidential election and this polarization that the U.S. is witnessing, can either candidate bridge this divide?
I'm not sure. I mean, I certainly don't think Trump can. I think that however apolitical or, concerned, however much Trump voters may be unconcerned with issues and concerned with action, what is very clear is that they have a very narrow view of what it means to be truly American and a very limited view of what sort of views and what sort of what sort of people should be in the national community. The deep antipathy to immigrants, to Muslims, to women, and to in a certain concealed aspect toward African Americans, toward American Indians. There's no way, however much Trump voters may want something to get done, the truth is that Trump is a deeply polarizing candidate, and he's not going to be able to bridge any particular divide. As for Hillary, again, she is always been, she has the same problem in that she alienates the voters who like Trump. So she's going to be very hard-pressed to overcome any of this polarization, even if she is probably more politically savvy and more capable, I think, given her personality and experience, of at least attempting to make these sorts of bipartisan deals. She might be able to bridge some elements of the divide, if not by attracting moderate Republicans, then by at least by attracting Republicans who are more concerned with economic stability than they are with having their grievances represented. But even then, I don't think either of them will be able to cure the country's polarization simply through the process of an electoral campaign.
All right, Bill, Ben,
hello?
excuse me, we'll have to leave it there on that note. We've just run out of time, but thank you very much for joining us. Lara Brown, Arjun Appadurai, and Ben Margulies, thanks for joining us on Inside Story, and thank you for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website. And for further discussion, you can reach out to us on Facebook or Twitter. The address you can see right there at the bottom of your screen from myself and the whole team here in Doha. Goodbye for now.